Hello and welcome to Track Changes. I'm Murray Griffin from climate change communications consultancy, Earthed. Today's three guests each have a career path that's very different from most of us. Each of them worked in the oil and gas industry for quite a few years, and then they each left the fossil fuels industry to dedicate their working lives to stopping climate change. They left the oil and gas industry in very different circumstances. For one, it was the result of a gradual disillusionment with the company, which eventually became impossible to ignore. For another, it involved a much more sudden recognition that the company had no moral compass. And for the third guest, circumstances outside work, to do with the fragility of life, prompted a period of reflection and a decision to leave the oil and gas industry. These career backstories give today's guests unique insight into how fossil companies really think and operate, taking us behind the PR spin. They're going to share those insights with us in this chat, and I think you're going to really enjoy what each of them has got to say, as well as the way they bounce off each other's comments along the way. Lindsey Gulden once worked for Exxon and is now Principal Data Scientist with Leg Up Data, which provides data insights to advance the energy transition. Alex Hillman used to work for Woodside and is now Lead Analyst with the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility. And Bourne held several senior executive roles in BP before heading up Environment Group WWF Australia, then chairing the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and then taking up a role as councillor with the Climate Council. Let's get into it and hear from Lindsey, Alex and Greg. Welcome to Track Changes, Lindsey, Greg and Alex.
Good to be here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great to be here.
So can I ask you each, first up, what led you to be working for a fossil fuel company? What were the circumstances in which you left? And what have you been doing since you left? So, Lindsey, would you like to kick off on that one?
Sure. So I set out to get a graduate degree in climate science, and I wanted to be a research professor. But I realized midway through my doctorate that was going to be a very intense life, and I was looking for something that would let me have more balance. So I was doing my degree at the University of Texas at Austin, where oil and gas has a lot of recruitment. And I ended up accepting a job offer at ExxonMobil for multiple reasons, probably one of which I was tired of eating ramen noodles, but
yes,
more to the point, I was going to be able to do really interesting research with really smart, congenial people. And I, at the time, in the late 2000s, Exxon was talking a pretty good talk about being a part of the energy transition. So they had shifted their external messaging with the change of the CEO. And they were talking about how climate change was indeed an existential crisis and that they wanted to be part of the solution. So I joined Exxon. I worked there for more than 10 years. Over the course of my time there, my skepticism about their commitment to the energy transition definitely grew because we just weren't progressing quickly. I ended up being fired by ExxonMobil, not related to climate change, but rather because I reported a garden variety $10 billion fraud. It was really only after that happened that I sat back and realized that if ExxonMobil was willing to fire me for telling them to stop violating the law, firing me in violation of a few more laws, that there was really nothing to keep them from being a bad actor in terms of the energy transition.
Yes.
And so I pivoted and am now working as a climate data scientist and researcher, working to advance an equitable energy transition.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Lindsey. And Alex, over to you.
Yeah, I was a massive maths nerd. I just wanted something technically challenging, somewhere I could use my maths. Yeah, and then I think after I finished uni, I was working with BP, started to pay a bit more attention to sustainability and climate change. I moved out of oil and gas for a little bit. So I was working on a refinery to start with, oil refinery, worked in sustainability in various roles, and then got someone asked me to come and work for Woodside. So, for me, with my sustainability mindset, but engineering background, is like, well, I'm only really going to do that to have some impacts and to help decarbonize that sector. So, it was pretty clear going into my time at Woodside through the interview process that, that was where my passion was. Obviously I'd come and do the job. It was an engineering job I had to start with. But yeah, so I was in Woodside for 9 years in the end, most of that time. So I came in as an engineer, but most of that time I spent in the climate side of things. So statutory reporting, voluntary reporting, climate risk, lots of lobbying as well.
Yep.
Yeah, and then in the end, I think the cognitive dissonance of trying to change this big beast that was, publicly saying a few of the right things, but the language around that was becoming more and more kind of specific and kind of obfuscated what it was really thinking. So
yes, yep.
And just achieving change. When I started in the climate role, it was kind of ground zero. So Australia's carbon price had just been repealed, and Woodside was back to not really doing or thinking much about climate change. So making those first incremental changes, it felt like there was material steps forward. But then as climate change became a bigger issue, I think Woodside realised it was more existential and less of like a little side sustainability issue. Making successive incremental changes became harder and harder. And eventually that was, I realized I just wasn't going to have much more positive impact from the inside.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Look, thanks very much for sharing that. Greg, over to you.
All right. Well, the way I got into the oil and gas industry was I had a scholarship with BP to work at University of Western Australia and also down at BP Refinery Kwinana. So West Australian got into the oil business that way. Very, very different time. And then as soon as I had graduated, I actually went to the UK, worked in research for a while, and then went into the exploration production business in the Middle East, and then moved around the world, occasionally coming home once, drilling for oil off the Northwest Shelf. When I finally came back, I was in charge of BP Australasia and had obviously strong relationships with Woodside. And in one of my earlier returns, yes, I was actually in charge of the BP 1/6 share of the Woodside. So I know Woodside very, very well. I know the oil business there extremely well. And the reason I left, Murray, is sort of very much personal in the sense that my parents died far too young, and you get to a certain point and you suddenly say, "Oh hell, what next?" And so I then left BP, and I could say the rest is history.
Yes, 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 and those are very hard reasons, and that sort of thing often does trigger a period of great reflection. You went on from that to be, well, tell us a bit about your career after that.
Yeah, so basically, when I was with BP the last few years, based in Australia, we had really tried to transform and started moving on into trying to be an energy company. It eventually failed, and that's another story. I actually took a year off and traveled around the world, talking to many, many different people, catching up with friends that that have become Christmas cards and Easter cards, and a lot of that. But also, reflecting on what was it I wanted to do next. And then when I came back, just by chance, a friend of mine said, "Why don't you apply for the job of CEO of WWF Australia?" Which I did, and I got that role. Yes. And the main reason for getting that role was I'd been involved in climate change, believe it or not, going back to 1989, and also looked at the effect of climate change on nature, and basically we're saying to WWF, look, if you don't tackle climate change, then everything you've done in the last 60 years so brilliantly will be undone.
Yes.
And then spent 6 years with them, then became chair of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency for a while. But yeah, climate change and energy I've been involved in since 1989.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And Alex, I'm just going to come back to you. Tell us what you're doing now, because I know that you're doing some really interesting work. So fill us in.
Yeah, now I work for an organisation called the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, or ACCR. I'm their lead oil and gas analyst. And we're a shareholder advocacy and research organisation. And basically what we do is we look at the climate and the business plans of large emitters, and then we engage with their investors and encourage them to use their rights as investors to encourage better strategy and performance around climate from these companies. So I spent a lot of time digging in to the business cases and the climate disclosures and the emissions profiles of these companies, and trying to find opportunities where we can both reduce emissions and increase value.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Look, thanks to the three of you for sharing those stories. Can I ask you, we see such careful messaging from fossil companies, and it's been vetted by lawyers and teams of PR people by the time it gets to us. How does that messaging differ from the reality of what they're doing? Maybe Alex, do you want to kick us off first there?
Yeah, I think so mate, one thing I've just got to be clear about up front is we're currently waiting for a court verdict on what's effectively a greenwashing case between ACCR and Santos. So so we're heavily in that space, but I can't talk to those Santos issues. But reflecting on Woodside, I think their disclosures are very carefully worded and they're very specific. So generally we think they're truthful, but they typically obfuscate what's really happening. Woodside seems to give a huge amount of attention to that specific accuracy, but I think at times they kind of lose sight of the bigger picture. And I suspect just organizationally, they just don't, these organizations are large, cohesive. Well, they've got a strong corporate culture. You don't do well by criticizing the organization. So I think that tends towards a fair chunk of groupthink, and I think it really hinders its ability to critically analyze itself.
Yep.
And I think some of the things they say, just stretch the bounds of reality. Like the current suite of advertisements from Woodside is all about challenge accepted, and I think it's almost like so they talk about support renewables with gas, challenge accepted. And it seems to me that's like specifically designed to have no substance. Like what does challenge accepted means? You can't criticize them for being wrong. No. And then what they're saying is just like a general vibe that has no actual substance. Yes. So I think that's one part of it, is they're moving away from specifics to make sure they don't say anything that's specifically wrong. And there are other times I think that type of groupthink, like all oil and gas companies talk about affordable energy. Except if you're selling LNG, like short of nuclear, like it's literally the most expensive form of energy you can get. And it's like they haven't actually stopped to think about it. It's just part of their patter of what they say is we supply energy and it's affordable, and energy security and poverty and stuff. There's all these kind of like buzzwords, and they don't stop and think about if that honestly reflects their business. Yeah. So LNG, Woodside, LNG producer. LNG is a dirty fossil fuel that's super expensive, and anytime a country's buying LNG, especially a price-sensitive country with energy access issues, if they're spending money on expensive energy, it actually reduces the amount of energy they could buy. If they're buying cheaper renewable energy, you'd actually alleviate energy poverty faster. So I think that, for various structural reasons and cultural reasons, the messaging come out of these organizations, I think, is disingenuous, let's say. But I think generally it's factually correct.
Okay. All right. And Greg, your thoughts on the messaging versus the reality?
So I think I'd first say that the reality has changed over time, and I'll use BP as an example, but I can also then talk about Shell and some of the other companies as well. In that, very definitely in the late 1990s, you could see that climate change was going to be a strategic issue, and for BP, we got out of coal, we got out of heavy oil, got out of tar sands. We got into gas because we thought that was more of a transition fuel, but we also got into renewable energy. At one stage, we were the largest photovoltaic PV panel manufacturer in the world.
Really?
China soon took over, yeah.
Yeah.
But genuinely saying, right, okay, how do you turn from being an oil and gas company, and indeed coal one time as well, how do you do that and move into becoming an energy company? And inside the company and the realities, it was thought this is a really good thing to do. But then you get a sort of like a downturn in the market, and the dividends aren't covered as much as you would particularly like. And then the discussion becomes, we should stick to the knitting. We should stay with oil and gas. We should stay with exploration. We should stay with the chemical part of the industry. We should ditch this other stuff. And a culture war effectively comes into play. And in BP's case, we eventually lost the CEO who was driving it, and the next CEO decided to change things again. And so in the reality, and then the communication of that reality, it was really coherent. But in the change, it became incoherent. And that really is what happens. And what we're now seeing, for example, the way I look at, and again, I'll say with Woodside, Woodside talks a good talk. It's got some nice looking ads, but the whole structure and strategy relies on basically a slowing down of global climate talks. And in that space, continuation of fossil fuel production. And it relies on them being the lowest cost producer, which is a bit of a laugh, and then make hay while the sun shines. So their reality is, funnily enough, true to form over time, because they've never actually pretended or tried to be anything other than a gas condensate company.
Yep. Okay. And Lindsey.
I guess I view, having left Exxon, and stepping back to look at the information landscape, I was really staggered by the scale and the multifaceted nature of what I see as a purposeful disinformation campaign,
Right.
at least in the United States.
Yep.
So Exxon and other oil and gas companies have a extremely sophisticated, well thought out, multi-targeted, multifaceted campaign to portray themselves as leaders in climate change, as a dependable member of the energy transition, when they're anything but. In fact, they put forth carbon capture and storage and, quote, clean hydrogen, neither of which are good for the climate, neither of which are climate solutions, as reasons why they are helping us to weather climate change. But in reality, carbon capture and storage and hydrogen are mechanisms that oil and gas see as a way for them to weather the energy transition without actually having to change their fundamental business model. So across the United States and likely through the world, there's a purposeful disinformation campaign to deflect responsibility for climate change, basically saying, hey, everybody's a part of the problem. We're trying to be part of the solution. There is a purposeful campaign to portray LNG as clean when it's anything but, as was mentioned. There's all sorts of disinformation campaigns that are targeted both at, quote, elite consumers and everyday folks, from every single angle you can come up with. You see things in the New York Times, you see ads on everyday TV. Academics are funded to do research. They end up being on the IPCC. It's a really sophisticated, very disingenuous mechanism to preserve market share.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those are sort of somewhat depressing answers, but
Sorry,
yeah.
I'm great at cocktail parties.
Thanks very much for that. My next question, I guess, the three of you have been out of these companies for some time now. Have you observed any positive changes in these companies in the years since? And how have they failed to change? And have they changed for the worse in any ways? I'll come back to you first, Greg, because you did sort of touch on this in your previous answer. But if you could elaborate a bit, what sort of changes have you seen since, for the good, if any, and for the worse, if as well?
I think I'll come back to a combination of sort of people and purpose. And, for a corporation, at the most the simple end is, you got to make money for your shareholders, and that's your sole purpose, in life. Now, as an individual, if you eventually become the CEO, you can either carry on with that mantra. That's all we have to do is make as much for the shareholder as possible. We don't have any corporate responsibilities, anything that's to do with equity and people and life does not matter. So what I see as I look at the succession of people, CEOs of BP, I look at the ones who of Shell, of some of the other companies I've seen as well, you end up with people who are prepared to live with that struggle of how do I satisfy the shareholders, my fiduciary duties and so on, but how do I actually build a company with purpose, which is beyond just the shareholder? And that I think is a genuine, almost moral, ethical struggle. Most people fail at it and hold on to just my fiduciary duty. And what I'm seeing now more and more, and the three examples actually from this last sort of 6 or 7 months, Shell has basically said publicly that they are sort of sticking with the knitting. The new BP CEO in January basically said the renewable change is not going the way it was expected to. We're sticking to the knitting. And, Woodside effectively channeling the BP CEO said exactly the same thing. We're just going for the gas and the play. And anything that's therefore coming out on, if you like, purpose beyond the fiduciary duty, I think Lindsey said it really well, is actually sort of purposeful disinformation. It's not incorrect, but it is disinformation. But basically, they've nailed their colors to the mast, and that mast is basically, we are making money for this year, next year, and the year after, basically, I feel like a 3-year horizon, and we'll keep doing that out for 30, 40, 50, 60 years as well, and to damn with everything else.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go to the other two for an answer to the same question, but I just want to quickly follow up on one point, which is that you said it's not incorrect, but it is disinformation. So could you just elaborate on that, what you mean there?
So a good example is that with Woodside, the first commissioned paper about why LNG was good for us is 1996, and it basically looks at what is what's the emissions profile in the exploration, the production, the transformation, the transportation, and then the use as LNG goes from Australia into Japan and elsewhere. And it's not a particularly good piece of work, but it basically allows them to then talk about it's good for the world. Gas is good for the world. There's much more work that's been done subsequent to that, for example, from the National Energy Technology Laboratory in America, showing country by country LNG supplier to LNG customer and showing basically it's no better than coal. But the story is just according to a set of numbers. Now, those numbers are sort of correct, but it's unbelievably disingenuous then to leap to, and we're better than everyone else by a long shot. It really is totally disingenuous.
Okay. All right. Look, thanks. And Lindsey, I'll come to you. Changes you've observed, both positive and negative, since the time that you left Exxon.
That's a really good question, and I'm actually stuck on a similar observation to Greg's several insightful points. I do not know if the observed and definite pivot back to, you know what, oil and gas companies is a good thing or a bad thing. It's definitely happened in the U.S. Because of there are many, an overprint of very, dare I say, deteriorating political situation that is providing additional cover for that. But globally, we've seen oil and gas basically say, well, never mind. We're oil and gas companies, we'll figure it out. I tend to think that is actually good for the long term, for the energy transition, because
really, because I can hear Lindsey in the background. I can hear the jaws of a lot of listeners just dropping. Because so elaborate on that.
The reason I think it's good, is because the jaws of your listeners are dropping.
Yeah,
I think it's good because it somewhat dispenses with the pretense. Because
right, yep.
My perception is that even we're an energy company, we're shifting, we can do tough things, LNG, was a bit of a pretense. Not a bit of a pretense. I don't think that oil and gas, for the most part, not individuals, but as a class of people, oil and gas executives had a whole lot of goal other than making money for the shareholders. I don't think they ever really were serious about the energy transition. So the fact that they've dispensed with the pretense is, I think, a good thing. But you could also argue the opposite point. It's a bad thing.
Okay. All right. Look, thanks for that. Alex, your thoughts?
I think that very, very interesting conversation. On this one, I'm in Lindsey's camp.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think oil and gas companies, BP in the time period was, in senior roles in BP, I think it was genuinely trying to transition. And it was putting, I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm guessing a few percent of CapEx into that transition. If you look in recent years, same again, oil and gas companies have tried again to pivot into renewables and hydrogen and, things that that make them feel like they're part of the energy transition. But the things oil and gas companies are good at that the low carbon world needs are not things that are low-cost solutions and not things that are going to be large-scale solutions. So, hydrogen, CCS, at some point the world will need those, but they're expensive. So they're not the low-hanging fruit, and we're not going to need them in large scale because the bulk of our energy system is going to be renewables and electrified through the rest of our system. So I think, and I don't think anyone is in a position saying the energy transition is happening fast enough. But capital allocation to clean energy is accelerating. It's compounding. It's growing, quite quickly in an absolute sense. So the energy transition is happening. Oil and gas companies have not been a big part of it, but they seems like they've been part of it. And I think when they take that mask off, when they stop maintaining the pretense that they're part of the solution, we're going to have a much more honest conversation about the role of these companies. Which is, in our view, is to sensibly and safely provide oil and gas for the short duration where we can get off fossils as quickly and rapidly as possible.
Okay, those are all really interesting answers. And so just before I move on to the next question, I'm going to ask whether anybody wants to sort of comment or augment what they've said based on how others have responded, or should I just kick on?
Murray, let me make a comment on that as well. It's interesting, and I would say that there was a time in BP we genuinely thought we could pivot and become an energy company, and then eventually leave behind the fossil fuel side. At the same time, interesting enough, I always thought that Exxon would never do anything except get to a particular point where, out of loose change, they would buy the biggest PV manufacturer or the biggest wind manufacturer and get that way in. So you don't go into it bit by bit. You just go and buy them.
Yes.
And that's a legitimate strategy. But more and more, it looks like the companies are more like sort of like typewriter companies, in the sense that, right, we'll stick to the typewriter on a continuous basis. All this other stuff, by the way, called these days we call laptops and iPads and things like that. Well, we'll keep typing. That's what we're going to do. We'll keep typing. And when you actually look at it now, the very large PV manufacturers and the very large wind companies are as big as most of the oil companies. So they left it too late.
Yep. Okay. All right. Look, thanks to you all. Yeah.
I know I went last, but can I just build off something Greg said earlier as well?
Yeah.
Is it there's this balance between fiduciary duty and like a moral compass, I think was the sort of language Greg was using. There's this perception that there's this trade-off, but a lot of our research, most of my day job is looking at the business performance of these oil and gas companies, and it's remarkably shocking. So Woodside has earned less than 1% per annum for the last 15 years. So it's earned less than inflation. It's less than a government bond. So it's a long-term, chronic, systemic underperformer. And it's not just Woodside. Santos is similar. The oil and gas sector, so MSCI splits the world's developed country stock markets into 10 sectors. The energy sector, which is 99% oil and gas, is not just below average. It's the worst performing sector over 10 and 15 years. So this dichotomy that a lot of people have between, we've got to trade off economic growth with the climate. It's actually a false dichotomy, because these oil and gas companies, they're clearly making climate change worse. I think that's uncontested, but they're also clearly not delivering on shareholder returns. And I think that's this big gap in this debate. Is like there's no tension here, but they're not making shareholders wealthier, and they're definitely making the climate worse. So it's a vast bulk of oil and gas production. There's this win-win opportunity to allocate less capital to it.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in before I move on? Yeah, Lindsay.
That's truly fascinating. I think that's a really insightful point, and I think that it explains why, at least here in the United States, oil and gas are diving in to CCS, quote, clean hydrogen, which is basically fossil hydrogen, another market for methane, because various, quote, blue ammonia, because they are able to have a subsidy business. So I think they recognize that their declining profits that in their traditional sector, and they have pivoted to do their best to essentially take copious quantities of government subsidies. I've recently done work quantifying the amount of lobbying that the oil and gas sector has done here in the United States, specifically targeting CCS subsidies, and it's a staggering amount of money. And they've been very successful in getting billions and billions of dollars of direct government subsidies to the price of oil. So I think they're responding to this shift in the market by becoming subsidy producers for CCS, which is a very inefficient way to use capital to pivot to the energy transition. The very last thing you want to do is spend money on CCS to preserve fossil fuels. We're much better off investing that money, investing those subsidies in ready right now solutions that are renewables, wind, battery storage. And I think the oil and gas sector knows that. And that is why they are embarking on these massive PR campaigns to talk about how they are very good investments, how the disinformation about CCS, it's all part of one grand scheme to preserve their traditional bottom line.
Okay. All right. Look, thanks for those comments. They're all terrific. And at the end, I'm going to ask each of you whether whether there's anything you want to add based on the discussions so far today. But I'd like to move on and to ask you, no company is a monoculture. Are there many people who are committed to action on climate change still working within these companies? And are they managing to get runs on the board? And how high can they go? Are there people on boards within these companies that are committed to action? And also, what's your advice to the ones who have stayed? So, there's three questions rolled into one. But Alex, I'm going to come to you first. Those left behind, what are your thoughts? What's your message to them?
I like the framing of the question. Those left behind. It assumes they're going to catch up at some point. I think as I said earlier, these companies don't make great shareholder returns. They're becoming a smaller part of our economy. They're inevitably shrinking. Love the framing of the question. I think completely agree that I agree that no bunch of people is a monoculture, and there's individuals within these companies that are trying to do the right thing. I think one thing I thought working within them and seeing their behavior from the outside is they kind of evolve as a single entity. So, the company kind of has its own purpose. And it sounds all a bit abstract, but maybe I'll give you one specific example. Possibly the scariest thing I saw and heard when I was working with Woodside was a senior engineering manager, and I forget the issue, but he goes, it's not the decision I would have made, but I'm not making a decision for me. I'm making a decision for Woodside, and I think that explicit willingness to leave your morals at the door, I think, is truly terrifying. When you take off your sense of what's right, and then you go and make a decision on behalf of this organization, or contribute to a decision on behalf of this organization, I think that wedge in your moral being is truly terrifying, and creates the opportunity for really bad things to happen. I do think there's some good people. There's lots of good people inside these companies, not just brilliant, but also ethically, righteous people. But I think as a whole entity here, that there's not a lot of room for that to be acted upon. In fact, it actively is stamped out. I did see people rise up through the ranks who were good people, but I think they'd know that they've got to kind of put a face on. They need to present in a certain way. They need to support the company and its stated objectives and so on. So, I don't think people who are trying to change the company and make it a better place in the moral sense tended to do very well by being themselves. And then advice to people who've stayed, I think, just kind of raise issues. I think, break out of that groupthink as much as you can. I thought I was fairly as removed as you could be as a Woodside staff member from that kind of groupthink mentality. I thought I was quite a challenging, questioning type of personality. And then I left Woodside and started analysing it from the outside and realised I was still part of that bubble. So I don't think it's easy, but, ask the hard questions, ask the organisation, are we genuinely providing affordable energy? Are we genuinely providing low emissions energy when most of the world's incremental new energy is coming from renewables? So I think just keep probing, keep raising those issues, keep asking the hard questions. And I think also look for opportunities to leave. So, don't go buy a yacht or a holiday house. Get your finances in order so you're not dependent on that massive salary for any longer than you need to be. And actually have an exit strategy and actually we're looking for that.
Yeah. Okay. Those are good points. Greg, over to you. Your thoughts.
Well, certainly, it's very, very hard to create a complete monoculture. You can obviously, some of the military organizations, for example, often have a monoculture and they need it for their particular purpose. certainly within BP, we looked a lot at values. We had the expression about, our employees do not leave their values behind when they come through the door. But if you then decide to focus, like, again, my former company BP has decided to focus, what you find is that a lot of people do actually leave. And many, many, many of the senior people that I knew at that particular time are outside in renewable energy companies, on boards, working on climate change and so on. Which is, if you're going to leave, well, leave and leave with a purpose and put your purpose into being. The question about people staying behind, it depends where you are in the pecking order and where, what you actually need to do. But there is a point where discomfort comes, and then you actually have to look into your soul and make a decision. And it's really hard. So let me just posit, the person who has just got, 3 kids at home, the partner hasn't got a job at the moment, I need the money, I've got to keep going, I'll keep my head down for a while. But you always have to look into your soul and make a decision on what you need to do. And it's hard, but that's why we have souls.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. That's a good response. And Lindsay, your thoughts?
I think these are really interesting questions. I'm going to leave the question of whether good people are at the top to the religious folks. I don't think that's my place. I think a related question is similar to what Alex and Greg have been touching on, which is why is it that we have a setup where we depend on a few executives in a few very powerful corporations to be good people in order for the world to be okay? So I think, at least in the United States, we have created for ourselves a situation where we have corporations that are entities with almost all of the same rights as an individual. So they, especially with recent court decisions, they are they're treated as people can give make political speech, but they don't have a soul and they don't have any morals. And so we've created this vehicle that its Achilles heel is that if the wrong people get in control of that corporation, or if people without souls get in control of that corporation, it can be used to line the pockets or advance the interests of those not so good people at the expense of the public good.
I guess this question is a follow-up. I mean, do you think the expertise within these companies is being significantly downgraded because people don't want to work for them? And do you view these companies as being capable of transitioning to net zero? I am going to start with you, Alex.
In terms of the impact on the talent and the capability of these organisations, I think, I've heard from some of my peers who are still in oil and gas, and they go, we're definitely not getting the 18 in the graduates each year. The quality of the people coming into these organisations has taken a significant downturn from, what I hear. In terms of whether or not the organisations are capable of transitioning to net zero, I think a better question is, do we need them to? So, like I said earlier, the energy transition isn't happening fast enough, but it is accelerating and it is progressing at pace. And these companies haven't really materially contributed to date. So I think if they can contribute and they can pivot to a net zero entity and they can deliver on shareholder returns in that process, then that's amazing. They should be supported. If they can't do that, then I think that's fine as well. But we don't need these companies to build our new energy system. We just need our economy to build the new energy system. And if these companies aren't part of that in the long term, I think that's completely fine. If they just safely and securely provide the diminishing amounts of fossil fuels that we need as we work through that transition, that's a completely fine outcome as well.
Yep. All right, Lindsay, over to you.
I fully agree with what Alex just said about new graduates. I don't think you're necessarily maybe in the long run. So I don't think in the moment that's necessarily a problem, but over time, especially as more and more people recognize that, hey, oil and gas is not doing much to help the climate, it'll become harder and harder for them to get the workforce. I think it's really interesting what Alex just said. Do we really even need them to pivot to net zero? I don't think. I've come to the conclusion. So when I joined ExxonMobil, I thought the exact opposite way. But now, nearly 20 years later, I think that the only solution to climate change is actually a political solution.
Yeah.
I don't think, at least in the United States, I don't think the way that our things are set up gives companies the proper incentive to take the oil and gas. It gives oil and gas companies the incentive to take the necessary action to become true energy companies and not oil and gas companies.
Yeah.
I think people have to stand up. Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, regardless of where you live, recognize that the only solution to climate change is to get off, to pivot, or to turn down the fossil fuel tap and pivot to renewables and battery storage as quickly as we possibly can.
Yes.
And once people realize that and demand it from their political representatives, I think we have some hope.
Okay. And Greg, your thoughts on them?
So I'm pretty hard now in the way I think about this. I have said that the companies now have the zeal of a drug lord as they push their products. And with drugs, obviously you have supply side, you have the demand side, you have a chain and everything in between. And when you're doing that, you know, pushing your products, you also try to weaken the resolve of the recipient. You want the habit not to be kicked. And that's basically where I place them at the moment. I also see a strategic abandonment of remediation liabilities, basically working on the fact that we will, whether it be oil, whether it be gas, or whether it be coal, we'll dig it and ship it for as long as we can. We will ask for extensions for as long as we can, which allows us to discount back to the present day the remediation liabilities so they don't really show up on the balance sheet. But when push comes to shove, we walk, and you, the state, territory, government, pick up the pieces. And you see it even in, just some of the, the offshore platforms, which will now get flipped over into becoming reefs. You see this in coal mines, which will continue to become holes in the ground. And when you look at the mining community, just in Australia, we have something like 80,000 mines unremediated, some of them going back to the 1850s and things like that. But a strategic abandonment of remediation liabilities, that is what I think we are seeing now.
Right. Okay. I had never even thought of that. So thanks for those answers. And the zeal of a drug lord, that's a great phrase, Greg. Okay.
I concur. That's I'm going to use that.
Yeah, nice touch of poetry there. Now, we need to phase out fossil fuels. COP28 agreed to phase them down. Do these companies take that seriously? And what would a phase down involve for these companies? What are the first few steps for them? Lindsey, do you want to kick off on that one?
Boy, I'm not really a joy to have at cocktail parties, but I don't think they take that seriously based on the fact that they are, as Greg so poetically stated, the drug lords pushing the product. I think most companies have made the decision, strategic or otherwise, to double down on fossil fuels and ride the gravy train for as long as they can. And I don't think I think they're giving lip service to all things COP. So
yeah. Okay, but that's a valid point. But if they're basically to be told what to do, what would those steps? I mean, what does a phase down look like? Even if they don't.
I think Alex points out that we don't really need these particular companies. I think if they have chosen not to pivot to become true energy companies, as Alex rightly pointed out, there are very large, successful corporations who are able to provide the infrastructure and needs for wind, solar, battery storage. So I'm not really sure they need to be part of the solution if they are unwilling to get on the bandwagon.
Right. Okay. Alex, your thoughts?
In terms of face down, one kind of mental model I've got in my head of these companies is that I have one tool as fossil fuel development. And the saying, if your only tool you have is a how, every problem looks like a no. So I think these companies know how to do one thing. They're defined as a bunch of individuals and as large corporate entities. And so they kind of see more of the same as a solution to everything. And they kind of, mentally squint and frame the problems so that more fossil fuel seems to be the answer for everything.
Yeah.
So I think they're constitutionally averse to wind down.
Yep.
And I think it's going to be a real story. Yeah, even when it's not in investors' interests, which I think we can pretty clearly see for over a decade's worth of returns. It's what they know how to do. It's what they want to keep on doing. It's their self-identity. If they were pushed, by shareholders, by governments, by moral conscience, whatever it is, I think it's actually a very simple thing to do, and you just stop allocating capital to new projects. So, culturally, that's really contrary to where these organizations are. But just not spending billions of dollars on new fossil fuel projects is actually a very simple strategy. Like it's a one big idea that will change the future of these companies significantly.
Okay. All right. And Greg, your thoughts?
I actually don't think they have a role with regard to phase down. I actually do think it is government's responsibilities to do that, because basically you're asking them to extinguish themselves. That's not what they're likely to do. If you needed to do this, I used the phrase earlier on, a strategic abandonment of remediation liabilities. One of the ways you look at this is you basically say, you will abandon this by a certain date. You will set aside the money to do that. You can set yourself up as a remediation company as you sort of disappear completely. And if you don't do that, well, we will actually expropriate and actually do it for you. It gets to the point where, come back to the drug lord, when do you know of a drug lord who said, I'm going to go out of business? It does not happen. And so you just push and you just keep going. And just like I said earlier on, the typewriter company, kept going with typewriters. They're just museum pieces now, and that's where they're heading. So I do not see a role for them at all, because it would be disingenuous on a continuous basis. It is a role for governments, and they have to be quite hard-headed about this and say, this is the date, this is the time, and you pay for your remediation liabilities.
Yeah. Okay. Those are all very interesting points. I have one last question, which is more of a sort of general question. But before I ask it, I just wondered whether the discussion, has prompted any thoughts, whether any of you want to add something based on the discussion so far.
I'm actually really keen to hear more from Greg about the responsibility of government versus these fossil fuel producers and wind down. Like what does Greg mean by, or what do you mean, Greg, by saying it's the role of the government?
Yeah, sure. So the way I look at this is for us to tackle climate change on a global basis, we need, basically all the nations on Earth to be working together. They'll never totally be in lockstep, but basically working together to tackle that and to basically eliminate fossil fuels from our mix over time. And that's down to governments. And then when you come down to Australia, it comes down, we have our nationally determined contributions, which we will announce at some stage or other in the next, in a couple of 3 months, about how we're going to go. And then it comes down to states and territories. When it comes down to states and territories, that's where mines are. That's where, fossil fuel plants are. And taking the legislation in which allows you to control how much scope 1 and scope 2 emissions is key, but also beginning to step up to the plate of saying, we, Australia, have got to work on what we're going to do with the scope 3 emissions. Because if we don't, as Australia, think about the drug lord analogy and just let it rip, we have a problem. So Australia also has to step up to working with each of the countries to which we export and say, how are we going to stop this business? How are we going to slow it down? And it's working with Japan, working with Korea, working with China. And that's where you have to step. Because certainly the companies will not do anything about the scope 3 emissions. It's not in their interest whatsoever. So to my mind, it comes down to governments moving from just having a target to action to make sure that that target occurs.
Okay, I guess when I think of that, I agree with that, but I think that the separation between companies and governments, there's a lot of interaction there. There's a lot of lobbying, disinformation that was flagged up, and makes it hard for governments to do that. And so I don't think that can happen in isolation of thinking about how these companies are piled up as well.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well, look, I'm going to move to my last question, and I'm going to ask you first, Alex, and it's a general question. Tell us one fact or one insight that you think, if it was more widely understood, would help us move faster towards a better future.
I think it's that fossil fuel producers don't make lots of money. This mental model that many people have, that we got to trade off economic development against positive climate outcomes, is just a false dichotomy. They don't make a lot of money for shareholders. An energy system, the International Energy Agency says that a rapid accelerated transition to net zero is a lower cost energy system. So perpetuating fossil fuels, it's not good for fossil fuel shareholders.
Yep.
It's not a low cost solution for the broader society, and it's clearly making climate change worse. So we don't have this trade-off. There's this massive win-win opportunity by accelerating the energy transition.
Okay, and Lindsey, so the final question, tell us one fact or one insight that you think, if it was more widely understood, would help us move faster towards a better future.
That's a good question again. I think people around the world need to recognize that even though climate change is contrary to carbon footprint propaganda belief, not their fault. Climate change is not their fault as individuals. It is their responsibility as individuals, and that no one's coming to save them. So basically, again, as a political solution, people need to stand up, work together, and demand that their elected representatives put into place ways for us to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels to prevent more climate change.
Yeah. Okay. Good answer. And Greg, bring us home. What are your thoughts?
I, coined the analogy of the zeal of a drug lord because I believe that's how we look at it. And I actually will, with others, probably build on that analogy about weakening the resolve and, how the companies are strengthening the train. Because sometimes analogies are quite good. And when we, if we in Australia, for example, become too righteous, the fact that we've actually managed to reduce our emissions within country really well, but ignore the fact that we are putting hundreds of times as much into other countries, maybe the drug analogy begins to actually sort of sheet home.
Yeah.
And in the end, you want, I think, people to look at the companies as they go forward as pretty awful organizations. It wasn't always that way, but that's the way it's going. And the people aren't all that way either. But the organization that delivers that is just like a drug baron.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much to the three of you. That was a fascinating chat. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Murray.
I think you'll agree that was a great session, and it gave me a lot to reflect on. One thing it made me realise is that these companies and the industry associations they belong to are probably going to put a huge amount of time and resources into undermining UN climate talks. This will be particularly significant for COP31, which will probably be hosted by Australia and its Pacific neighbours in 2026. After all, these companies and associations like the Minerals Council of Australia and the Australian energy producers can see that there is zero chance of a fossil fuel-loving federal coalition government being returned to power in 3 years' time. So instead of focusing on interfering in Australia's domestic politics, I think it's a safe bet that they will work to undermine efforts to make a fossil fuel phase down a key element of COP31. In fact, there are signs that they're already working to undermine international action. A week or so ago, the New South Wales Minerals Council had an opinion piece in a Murdoch newspaper claiming that for Australia to have an ambitious 2035 emissions reduction target would be hugely economically destructive. It's worth pointing out that the opinion piece ran the day after the OECD, which represents developed countries and is headed by a former Australian Conservative politician, Matthias Cormann, issued a major new report on climate change. And that report said that ambitious climate targets and strategies can lead to greater GDP growth. I doubt you'll see the OECD report covered in the Murdoch press, though. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please take the time to rate it on the podcast platform you use. And please share the episode with colleagues who might be interested. I'm always keen for your feedback or suggestions for future episodes. And my email is murray, MURRAY, at earthed, EARTHED.au. And as Track Changes is a labour of love at the moment, I'd also be keen to hear from you if you're interested in sponsoring some episodes. See you next time.